Pick up that glass, Nora. You're fired. I'll leave, but one day you'll wish you had asked why my name frightened you.
Margaret, what did you just say to her?
Julian, stay out of this. Your past is finally catching up with you.
It was 6 weeks before the night that would end her marriage, though she did not know it yet. The rain came down over Greenwich, Connecticut, in long, relentless sheets, striking the tall windows of the Reyes estate like a warning nobody inside was willing to hear. Inside that cold marble foyer, beneath a chandelier that had cost more than most people earn in a decade, a woman named Margaret Calloway stood at the top of a curved staircase in a red silk robe, her knuckles white around the shattered pieces of a porcelain vase. Below her, on her knees, a woman named Nora Whitfield gathered the broken glass with bare hands, blood beginning to bead across her palm. Margaret's voice, when it came, was not loud. It did not need to be. It was ice-wrapped in silk, carrying easily across the marble. "You'll pay for that vase with your last paycheck," she said. "And then you'll pack your things and be gone before my husband gets home." Nora said nothing. She simply knelt there, gathering the shards one by one, the blood on her fingers mixing with the dust of what had once been something beautiful. What Margaret did not know, what she could not possibly have imagined as she turned and swept back into her bedroom without so much as a glance behind her, was that she was not firing a maid that night. She was setting into motion the unraveling of every lie she had spent nearly 15 years building her entire life around. She thought this was the end of a small, forgettable inconvenience. In truth, it was only the beginning of a reckoning that had been waiting patiently, quietly, for the right moment to arrive. And that moment was closer than she knew. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a woman with nothing but a torn cardigan and bleeding hands came to kneel on the floor of one of the wealthiest homes in Connecticut, we have to go back, not weeks, but 14 months, to a life that looked nothing like the one Nora Whitfield was living now. 14 months earlier, she was not a maid. She was not anyone's servant, not anyone's convenient target for humiliation. She was a woman standing in the wreckage of a life she had built with her own 2 hands, watching movers carry the last of her furniture out of a modest house in Danbury that no longer belonged to her. She was 52 years old, a widow, and until recently, she had spent 22 years as a high school English teacher, the kind who remembered every student's name years after they graduated, the kind who believed, quietly and stubbornly, that dignity was something no one could take from you unless you allowed them to. Her husband, Thomas Whitfield, had been a firefighter, the kind of man who ran toward buildings other people ran away from. He had died 2 years earlier, not from flames, but from a slow and devastating illness tied to the years he had spent inhaling smoke and chemicals no one had properly warned him about. The insurance company had fought her for 18 months before finally, grudgingly, covering a fraction of what the treatments had cost. By the time Thomas passed, the medical debt had already swallowed their savings whole, and within a year, it had swallowed their home as well. Nora stood on the front lawn that final morning, watching strangers carry away the bookshelves her husband had built with his own hands, and she did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of her son. Her son, Caleb, was 20 years old, home from community college for the weekend, insisting he would drop out to help her. Nora would not hear of it. She stood in that half-empty driveway, boxes stacked around her like the ruins of a smaller, gentler life, and told him the same thing she had told him a dozen times before. "You are not losing your education because I lost my house." It was the kind of sentence that revealed everything about who she was. A woman who could lose almost everything and still find the strength to protect the one thing she had left. What she did not tell him, what she could barely admit to herself, was that she had no idea how she was going to survive the months ahead, let alone build something new from what remained. The following week, Nora sat across from a staffing coordinator at a domestic employment agency in a strip mall off Route 7, filling out a form that asked about her experience in housekeeping and childcare. It was a strange and quietly devastating moment for a woman who had once graded essays on Steinbeck and led classroom discussions on Shakespeare, now checking boxes to prove she could clean floors and mind children for strangers. The coordinator was kind, if brisk, explaining that a placement had opened up at a private estate in Greenwich, a household in need of full-time domestic staff. The pay was good. The family, she was told, was prominent, wealthy, private. Nora did not ask many questions. She could not afford to be particular. She signed the paperwork with the same steady hand that had once signed report cards, and she told herself this was simply another chapter, not an ending. When Nora arrived at the Reyes estate for the first time, she barely recognized the world she was stepping into. Wrought iron gates opened onto a winding driveway lined with old oak trees, leading up to a house so large it looked less like a home and more like an institution, all stone and glass and manicured symmetry. She was driven up in a small staff shuttle by a woman named Dorothy Anagnos, who everyone simply called the estate's head housekeeper, a warm, sharp-tongued woman in her 60s who had clearly seen every kind of household drama imaginable. That gave Nora a crash course in survival before they had even reached the front door. Rule 1, she said, never let her see you look tired. Rule 2, never let her see you look happy. She hates both. Nora laughed despite herself, not yet understanding just how accurate that warning would turn out to be. Through one of the tall front windows, Nora caught her first glimpse of the woman she would come to know far too well. Margaret Calloway Reyes stood in the garden, directing a team of florists with sharp, clipped instructions, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable even from a distance. Not far from her, sitting alone on the stone steps of the porch, was a teenage girl no one seemed to be paying any attention to at all. Her name, Nora would later learn, was Sophia, Julian Reyes's daughter from his first marriage, a quiet, watchful girl who seemed to exist on the edges of her own home. Nora did not know it yet, but that lonely girl on the steps would become one of the most important relationships of her new life, one that would, in time, help unravel a secret far larger than either of them could imagine. That same afternoon, Margaret insisted on interviewing Nora personally, an unusual choice, that whispered, since she never bothered involving herself with staff. Margaret circled Nora slowly in the sitting room, asking pointed, uncomfortable questions about her financial situation, framing it as simple curiosity, though the intention behind it was unmistakable. She wanted to know exactly how desperate Nora was, exactly how much leverage that desperation would give her. Nora answered honestly, without shame, because shame was something she had decided long ago she would not hand over so easily. But there was one small moment that afternoon that neither woman acknowledged out loud, a flicker, barely visible, when Margaret signed Nora's paperwork and paused at the sight of her last name. Whitfield. For just a second, her hand trembled. Then it was gone, tucked away behind that same practiced, icy composure, as though it had never happened at all. In the weeks that followed, Nora began to understand the rhythms of a house that had clearly perfected the art of appearing perfect while hiding almost everything real beneath its surface. She learned which floorboards creaked outside Julian Reyes's study, which vases had already survived Margaret's temper and which ones had not, and that Julian took his coffee black each morning, standing at the kitchen island rather than sitting, as though he never quite trusted himself to slow down. She learned that Sophia often skipped breakfast entirely on the mornings she seemed most anxious, and that no one in that enormous house seemed to notice but her. Nora treated every person in that home with the same steady respect, whether it was the newest housemaid struggling to keep up or Julian himself, who barely looked up from his phone long enough to register her presence at all. Dot became something close to a friend in those early weeks, the two of them sharing quiet cups of coffee in the staff kitchen before the household woke, trading small observations about the family they served. It was Dot who first noticed that Nora had a gift for making people feel steadier simply by being near her, a quality that had clearly served her well in a classroom for over 2 decades. Nora mended a torn hem for one of the younger maids without being asked, hummed old hymns under her breath while ironing linens, and moved through her days with a quiet dignity that unsettled some and comforted others. She did not perform gratitude for her employers, nor did she perform misery for her colleagues. She simply did her work, and in doing so, she began, almost without realizing it, to change the emotional temperature of a house that had grown cold long before she arrived. It was late one night, well past midnight, when Nora first truly connected with Sophia. The teenager had crept down to the kitchen, expecting it to be empty, and instead found Nora sitting at the small staff table reading by lamplight. Sophia froze in the doorway, a worn paperback copy of a novel clutched awkwardly beneath her sweatshirt, the way a much younger child might hide a stolen cookie. Nora recognized the book immediately, a novel Sophia had clearly been assigned weeks earlier and had fallen dangerously behind on, and rather than scold her or send her back upstairs, Nora simply patted the chair beside her. What began as 10 quiet minutes that night became a habit neither of them spoke about openly, stolen pockets of time where Nora, once again, became a teacher, guiding a lonely girl through literature no one else in that house had ever bothered to discuss with her. Those small sessions became the emotional center of Sophia's week, though she would never have admitted it out loud to anyone but Nora. One evening, curled into the corner of the kitchen bench with her knees pulled to her chest, Sophia said something that lodged itself permanently in Nora's chest. "My stepmother has never asked me one question about myself," she said quietly. "You've asked me 10 in 2 weeks. Nora did not respond right away. She simply reached over and gently squeezed the girl's hand, understanding in that moment that whatever she had lost when she left her classroom in Danbury, she had somehow found a small, fragile version of it again in this cold and glittering house, in the unlikely form of a lonely 16-year-old girl who simply wanted someone to notice she existed. Julian Reyes, for his part, began noticing changes in his household that he could not immediately explain. He came home one evening later than usual, exhausted from back-to-back meetings, and found Sophia laughing at the dinner table for what felt like the first time in over a year. He did not know why. He only knew that something in the house felt different, lighter somehow, though he could not have named the cause if pressed. Later that night, lying beside Margaret in their bedroom, he mentioned it briefly, almost in passing, asking if she had noticed Sophia seeming happier lately. Margaret's response was quick, dismissive, steering the conversation elsewhere with practiced efficiency, the way she always managed to redirect any conversation that came too close to the staff she so clearly resented having in her home. In that same conversation, almost as an afterthought, Julian mentioned an old business associate from what he called his Meridian days, a name he said with a strange, complicated heaviness that Margaret noticeably did not respond to at all. It was a small, unremarkable moment, the kind easily forgotten in the flow of an ordinary evening, and yet it would return later with far greater significance than either of them could have understood at the time. Julian did not press the subject further that night. He had learned, over years of marriage, which conversations Margaret preferred to avoid, and he had grown accustomed to letting those silences pass without question. It was a habit that would soon prove far more costly than he ever imagined. It did not take long for Margaret to notice the change in Sophia as well, though her reaction was nothing like her husband's. Where Julian felt curiosity, Margaret felt something closer to dread, an unease she could not quite name, but recognized instinctively as danger to the careful control she maintained over every corner of her household. She cornered Nora in a hallway one afternoon, her voice low and sharp, warning her plainly to remember her place, whatever small friendship she believed she was building with Julian's daughter. Nora listened without flinching, met Margaret's eyes without apology, and said nothing that could be used against her. But she understood, walking away from that hallway, that she had crossed some invisible line in Margaret's mind, and that the quiet peace of the last several weeks was not going to last much longer. The following weeks brought with them a growing sense of unease that Nora could feel, but could not fully explain, the kind of quiet tension that settles into a house before something finally breaks. Margaret was preparing to host a major charity gala, one designed to elevate Julian's public image ahead of a highly anticipated company launch, and the entire estate had transformed into a hive of frantic preparation. Designer gowns hung along the hallway upstairs like ghosts waiting to be worn. Caterers rehearsed their movements through the ballroom with military precision, and Margaret moved through it all with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Nora was assigned to serve that evening, told plainly and repeatedly by the event coordinator to remain as invisible as possible, to exist only at the edges of the room. She agreed without complaint, though something about the atmosphere that week left her with a quiet, unshakable sense that trouble was gathering just beneath the surface of all that polish. On the night of the gala, the Reyes estate glittered with a kind of beauty that felt almost theatrical, chandeliers blazing over a ballroom filled with some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the state. Margaret moved through the crowd like a woman performing a role she had rehearsed 1,000 times, gracious, radiant, utterly convincing to anyone who did not know her. Nora worked quietly near the edges of the room, refilling glasses, clearing plates, doing exactly what she had been asked to do. It was there, in front of dozens of Julian's business partners, investors, and members of the press, that Margaret orchestrated a moment that would haunt Nora for weeks afterward. She loudly accused Nora of ruining her gown, her voice carrying across the ballroom with practiced outrage, invoking cruel, dismissive language about people like her, people without proper training, without discipline, people who did not belong in rooms like this one. The room fell into an uncomfortable hush as Margaret's voice rang out, sharp and merciless, cutting through the soft hum of conversation and clinking glasses. Nora stood perfectly still, absorbing every word without collapsing beneath them, her face calm even as something inside her quietly broke. Across the room, Sophia watched in horror, her hands gripping the edge of a nearby table, unable to move, unable to speak. A few guests glanced away uncomfortably, choosing silence over intervention, the kind of quiet complicity that allows cruelty to continue unchecked in rooms full of powerful people. Julian was not there to witness any of it. He was upstairs in his study at that exact moment, taking an urgent phone call from his longtime attorney and closest friend, Marcus Feld, regarding an old file simply labeled Meridian, a conversation that would, in time, prove far more significant than anyone in that ballroom could have guessed. Later that night, in the quiet of the staff quarters, found Nora sitting motionless, her uniform still damp from spilled champagne, her expression carefully composed even as her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Dot was furious, insisting she would quit in protest, refusing to stand by and watch Nora humiliated in front of an entire ballroom. Nora gently talked her out of it, reminding her softly that she needed this job far more than she needed to win an argument with a woman who had never once had to worry about paying rent. When Caleb called later that night to check in, Nora said nothing about what had happened, keeping her voice light and steady, protecting him the way she always had, even now, even from 300 miles away. It was only after she hung up the phone that she finally allowed herself to cry, alone in the laundry room, muffling the sound into a towel so no one would hear. The following morning, Sophia slipped a folded note beneath Nora's door before leaving for school, a small gesture that would carry far more weight than either of them realized at the time. The note was simple, just a single line written in careful, uncertain handwriting. "You're the only adult in this house who's ever told me the truth," it read. "I'm sorry she's not." Nora read it twice. then carefully folded it and placed it inside the drawer of her nightstand, a small piece of comfort in an increasingly difficult season. That same afternoon, from an upstairs window, Margaret watched Nora crossing the garden below, her expression unreadable at first glance. Though anyone looking closely might have noticed, it was not triumph reflected in her eyes, but something closer to fear, quickly hidden behind her usual practiced composure before anyone else could see it. In the days that followed the gala, Margaret's unease hardened into something far more calculated, a quiet campaign designed to remove Nora from the household entirely before anyone could ask too many questions about why she felt so threatened by a woman who had done nothing more than show kindness to a lonely teenage girl. It began subtly, with small fabrications that would have seemed insignificant on their own. A bracelet went missing from Margaret's jewelry box, later discovered tucked inside Nora's locker in the staff quarters, though Nora had never once set foot near Margaret's private dressing room without explicit instruction. Reports of tardiness appeared in the household log, dates and times that did not match Nora's actual schedule at all. That was pressured, gently but persistently, to formally write Nora up for infractions that had never actually occurred, each incident small enough to dismiss individually, yet together forming a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. While tension quietly tightened inside the walls of the Reyes estate, Nora's life outside those walls was unraveling in ways that struck at the very heart of everything she had sacrificed to protect. Caleb called one evening with news that landed like a physical blow, explaining that he had taken on a second job just to keep up with tuition, and that his grades were beginning to slip as a result. He spoke carefully, almost apologetically, floating the idea of withdrawing from school entirely to help support her, the very outcome Nora had spent 2 years working herself to exhaustion to prevent. She listened to her son's voice crack slightly over the phone and felt something cold settle in her chest, the quiet horror of watching every sacrifice she had made begin to slip through her fingers because of decisions being made against her in a house she had no real power over. 2 nights later, after Margaret quietly altered Nora's shift without notice, Nora found herself standing alone at a bus stop in Greenwich as rain fell steadily around her, having missed the staff shuttle entirely because of the change. She stood beneath the thin shelter of a bus stop awning, soaked through her uniform, exhausted in a way that went far beyond physical tiredness, and quietly recited a line of poetry to herself, an old habit from her teaching years, something she used to keep her composure steady during her most difficult classroom days. It was a small, private moment of resilience that no one else witnessed, a reminder to herself that she had survived worse than wet shoes and a missed bus, though the accumulation of cruelty in recent weeks had begun to wear even her famously steady resolve dangerously thin. Inside the estate, Julian was beginning to notice things he could no longer easily dismiss. While searching for a misplaced document one afternoon, he came across the very bracelet Margaret had claimed was stolen, sitting quietly in her own jewelry box, exactly where it had always been, never missing at all. He said nothing to her directly, not yet, but something inside him shifted permanently in that moment, a quiet, growing suspicion that his wife had not been entirely honest with him about several things recently. That same week, he found himself once again reviewing old files with Marcus Feld, this time lingering longer than usual over a folder marked Meridian Capital, Settlement, Confidential, a file he had not opened in years, yet suddenly felt compelled to revisit, as though some instinct he could not fully explain was quietly guiding him back toward it. Margaret, sensing the ground beginning to shift beneath her, finally manufactured grounds she believed would be undeniable, and moved to have Nora dismissed from the household entirely. It happened on a stormy evening, rain hammering against the tall windows of the estate exactly as it had on so many other nights that season, when Margaret shattered a porcelain vase in a fit of temper and, without hesitation, blamed the damage entirely on Nora. She stood at the top of the curved staircase in her red silk robe, her voice carrying with practiced authority as Nora knelt below her gathering broken glass, blood beginning to bead across her palm from the sharp edges cutting into her skin. "You'll pay for that vase with your last paycheck," Margaret said coldly, her voice echoing through the marble foyer exactly as it had at the very beginning of this story. "And then you'll pack your things and be gone before my husband gets home." This was the same moment the story had opened with weeks earlier, though now, having witnessed everything that led to it, the injustice landed with far greater weight than it had the first time it was heard. Nora said nothing as she gathered the last of the broken porcelain, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of absorbing yet another blow in a season that had already asked so much of her. She rose slowly, collected her single box of belongings from the staff quarters, and walked out into the storm without a single word of protest, her dignity intact even as everything else around her seemed to be collapsing. Above her, from an upstairs window, Sophia watched the entire scene unfold in silence, tears streaming down her face, feeling utterly powerless to stop the injustice taking place directly beneath her. Nora arrived at a modest motel just off the highway that night, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and thin walls, the only shelter she could afford now that she had lost both her income and, within days, the small rental she had been barely managing to keep up with. She sat alone on the edge of a sagging mattress, rain still tapping softly against the window, and pulled out the one possession she carried with her everywhere, her late husband Thomas's old firefighter badge, tarnished slightly with age but still warm in her palm the way it always seemed to be. She spoke to it quietly, the way she often did in her most private, unguarded moments, admitting aloud how tired she was, how close she felt to breaking after everything the last several weeks had demanded of her. It was a vulnerable side of Nora that no one at the Reyes estate had ever been permitted to see, a grief she had carried silently beneath her composure for 2 full years. Caleb arrived the following afternoon, having taken a bus the moment he learned what had happened, refusing to let his mother face this latest blow entirely alone. He stood in the doorway of that small motel room, insisting once again that he wanted to leave school to help support her, and once again, Nora refused, her voice steady even though her circumstances had never felt more precarious. She told him plainly that losing a job was not the same as losing her resolve, and that she would find another way forward, just as she always had. It was in that same conversation, watching her son's stubborn insistence on sacrificing his future for her, that Nora quietly resolved to accept whatever opportunity came next, no matter how uncertain, simply to prove to Caleb that she still had options left. That opportunity arrived only 2 days later, in the unlikely form of a phone call from a man Nora had never met, an attorney named Marcus Feld. He explained, carefully and somewhat cryptically, that he had come across her name through old employment records and wanted to offer her a short-term consulting arrangement, reviewing certain paperwork in exchange for a modest fee. Nora was immediately suspicious, uncertain why an attorney she had never heard of would be interested in her at all, yet the offer arrived at a moment when she had little room left to question good fortune, however strange its origins seemed. Meanwhile, Nora continued reviewing the documents Marcus had given her, and slowly, details began surfacing that unsettled her in ways she could not immediately explain. A name appeared repeatedly throughout the paperwork, a signature she did not recognize, and a date that lined up disturbingly close to events from her own past that she had never fully understood. She found herself staring at one particular document late into the night, a name entirely unfamiliar to her, listed beside Margaret's maiden name in a context she could not yet make sense of. It was a small, quiet discovery, easy to overlook, and yet something about it refused to leave her alone. Tugging at a thread, she now felt an undeniable need to follow, regardless of where it might lead her next. A few days later, Marcus finally invited Nora back to his office, closing the door behind her with a quiet deliberateness that told her whatever he was about to say had waited far too long already. He sat across from her, folded his hands together, and began telling her a story that reached back nearly 15 years, long before she had ever set foot inside the Reyes estate. Her husband, Thomas, he explained, had once worked as a junior investor at a fund called Meridian, a name Nora vaguely remembered from old paperwork she had never fully understood after his death. According to Marcus, Thomas had uncovered evidence of serious financial fraud within that fund, fraud that reached all the way to the top of the company, and had been quietly preparing to report it to federal regulators before his life was cut tragically short. Marcus continued, his voice careful and measured, explaining that the fund at the center of that fraud had been run by a man named Richard Calloway, Margaret's first husband, years before she had ever married Julian Reyes. According to the records Marcus had spent months quietly investigating, Margaret had unknowingly co-signed several documents during that period, papers that, once the fraud came to light, could have implicated her directly alongside her husband. Before Thomas could formally report what he had discovered, he was diagnosed with the illness that would eventually take his life, an illness Marcus admitted he had long privately suspected was not entirely accidental, though nothing had ever been proven. Richard Calloway himself died shortly afterward in an unrelated incident, and Margaret, left alone with a scandal that never fully surfaced, quietly changed her name and disappeared from that chapter of her life entirely. Nora sat perfectly still as Marcus spoke, absorbing every detail with a kind of stunned, disbelieving silence, pieces of her husband's final months rearranging themselves in her mind with devastating new clarity. She remembered, suddenly, small moments from those last years, Thomas working late without explanation, a folder he had once kept locked in his desk drawer that she had never thought to question, a phone call he took privately one evening that he brushed off as nothing important. Marcus explained that when Nora's employment file crossed his desk months earlier, flagged simply because of her last name, he had spent every week since quietly confirming what he suspected before deciding whether he had any right to tell her at all. It was, he admitted quietly, one of the harder decisions of his career, weighing loyalty to an old friend against a truth someone deserved to finally hear. Word by word, the story rearranged everything Nora thought she understood about the last several months of her life. Margaret's trembling hand the day she signed Nora's paperwork suddenly made sense, not as simple discomfort, but as recognition, the quiet, private horror of seeing a name she had spent over a decade hoping never to encounter again. Her frantic campaign to remove Nora from the household, the fabricated bracelet, the falsified schedule, the public humiliation at the gala, none of it had ever truly been about class or status at all. It had been fear, plain and simple. The fear of a woman who had built an entirely new identity on top of a past she believed safely buried, only to watch the widow of the man who could have exposed everything walk quietly into her own home, into her own family, completely unaware of the history connecting them. Around that same time, Julian arrived at similar conclusions through an entirely different path, reviewing the Meridian file late into the night until the pieces finally aligned in his mind with sickening clarity. He confronted Marcus directly, demanding the full account rather than the cautious fragments he had been given so far, and Marcus, seeing no further reason to withhold it, told him everything. Julian sat in stunned silence for a long moment afterward, absorbing not just the fraud itself, but the far more painful realization that his wife had spent their entire marriage hiding a past connected, however indirectly, to the death of a man whose widow she had then subjected to months of calculated cruelty inside their own home. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, though something in it had clearly broken. "She didn't just lie to me," he said quietly. "She looked that woman in the eye every single day and made her clean up broken glass with her bare hands." Sensing that her carefully constructed world was finally collapsing around her, Margaret made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative before Julian could hear it from anyone else. She approached him first, framing Nora as a calculating opportunist who had somehow orchestrated her way into their household for the express purpose of extracting money or revenge, her voice trembling with what almost passed for genuine outrage. For a brief, tense moment, her performance nearly succeeded, Julian's expression flickering with uncertainty as old habits of trust reasserted themselves despite everything he already knew. But Julian had come prepared. He calmly laid out the documents Marcus had gathered, old emails, the original settlement file, and Thomas's preserved whistleblower report, evidence that dismantled her story piece by piece until there was nothing left for her to stand on. Margaret's composure finally shattered completely, not into remorse, but into raw, unfiltered panic, and she fled the room without another word, leaving Julian alone amid the wreckage of everything he had once believed about his marriage. Julian did not sleep that night. He sat alone in his study long after the house had gone quiet, staring at the folder that had appended everything he believed about the woman he married, before finally reaching a decision he knew could not wait until morning. He drove out into the darkness alone, past the same rain-soaked roads Nora had traveled weeks earlier, until he arrived at the small motel where she was staying, its neon sign flickering weakly against the night sky. He found her in the diner attached to the motel, sitting alone with a cup of coffee long gone cold, and he did not approach her the way a powerful man accustomed to solving problems with money or influence might have. He simply sat down across from her, and for the first time since she had entered his household, he spoke to her not as an employer, but as a man who owed her the truth, however painful that truth might be to deliver. He told her everything Marcus had uncovered, slowly and without excuse, watching her face carefully as each piece of information landed. Nora listened in silence, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup, absorbing a truth that reshaped her understanding of her husband's final months in ways she had never once imagined possible. She did not weep, not at first. Instead, something quieter and more complicated moved across her face, a strange, aching mixture of grief and vindication. The realization that Thomas had not simply been unlucky in his final years, but had, in fact, been trying to do something honest and difficult in a world that ultimately punished him for it. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. Though her eyes had filled with tears, she made no effort to hide. He always did the right thing, she said quietly, even when no one else would. Julian did not offer her money that night, understanding instinctively that doing so would cheapen the moment beyond repair. Instead, he made her a different kind of promise, one rooted in accountability rather than convenience. In the weeks that followed, he ensured that the original Meridian fraud records, long buried and forgotten, were properly submitted to federal regulators, finally exposing a scheme that had gone unpunished for nearly 15 years. He made certain that Thomas Whitfield was formally and publicly recognized as the whistleblower who had first uncovered the fraud, restoring a piece of his legacy that had been erased by his early death and the silence that followed it. A long overdue settlement, one that had been quietly sitting unclaimed for over a decade due to the collapse of the investigation, was finally released to Nora and her son, providing a measure of practical justice alongside the emotional one already unfolding. Margaret's fall from grace was swift, though notably restrained, unfolding through consequence rather than spectacle. She was quietly removed from any involvement in Julian's company, her name withdrawn from the philanthropic boards and social circles she had spent years carefully cultivating. She faced her own reckoning with regulators regarding the paperwork she had unknowingly signed years earlier, a legal process that stripped away much of the protective distance she had built between herself and her first husband's crimes. Julian did not seek public humiliation for her, choosing instead a quieter, more deliberate form of accountability, understanding perhaps better than anyone the damage that public cruelty could inflict on a person, regardless of what they had done to deserve consequences. It was justice without theater, and in its own way, it landed with far more weight than spectacle ever could have. Sophia, meanwhile, found herself navigating a complicated mixture of relief and heartbreak as her stepmother's secrets came fully into the light. She had always sensed something unresolved beneath Margaret's carefully polished exterior, though she had never imagined its true depth or origin. In the days following her father's confrontation with Margaret, Sophia approached him directly with a request that surprised even herself in its clarity. She asked that Nora be allowed to return to their household, not as staff this time, but formally as her tutor and mentor, a role that would finally allow Nora's true vocation to be recognized rather than hidden behind a maid's uniform. Julian agreed without hesitation, understanding that this small act of restoration mattered as much to his daughter's healing as any of the larger consequences still unfolding around them. Caleb's life changed as well, though in quieter, more private ways. With part of the settlement finally released, he no longer needed his second job, freeing him to focus fully on his studies for the first time in over a year. Mother and son sat together one evening in Nora's newly modest but stable apartment, working slowly through everything that had happened, Caleb learning for the first time the full truth about his father's final months and the honesty that had ultimately cost him his life. He looked at his mother that evening with a new kind of understanding, recognizing not just the woman who had raised him, but the woman who had quietly held their entire family together through two separate catastrophes, years apart, without ever once asking for recognition or relief. Several months later, Nora found herself once again sitting behind a desk, though this time it belonged to a small foundation Julian had established in Thomas's name, dedicated to supporting the families of workplace whistleblowers who had lost everything in pursuit of the truth. It was a quiet, deliberate echo of the very agency where she had once filled out paperwork checking boxes for housekeeping work. Only now she sat on the other side of that desk, helping others rebuild the way she once had to rebuild herself. She tutored Sophia twice a week, their sessions filled with the same quiet warmth that had first connected them in a midnight kitchen months earlier. One afternoon, Sophia looked up from her book and told Nora plainly that she was the only adult who had ever really talked to her like a real person, a sentiment that echoed something she had once written in a hidden note slipped beneath a bedroom door. Julian and Nora settled into something quieter than friendship, but far more solid than simple professional respect, a bond forged through hardship neither of them had chosen, but both had ultimately survived with their integrity intact. Margaret, largely absent from the family's daily life now, was seen only once more in this particular chapter of the story, standing alone at a quiet cemetery outside Danbury, placing a small bouquet of flowers at the base of a modest headstone bearing Thomas Whitfield's name. She said nothing aloud that anyone could hear, offering instead a silent, private acknowledgement of the harm her past had caused, a gesture that offered no full redemption, but perhaps the beginning of one. It was not forgiveness. It was simply the truth, finally allowed to exist in the open air after 15 years spent buried beneath silk robes, marble floors, and a name she had never truly earned the right to leave behind. On a quiet afternoon not long after, sunlight streamed through the same tall windows of the Reyes estate that had once witnessed so much cruelty within those walls. A new porcelain vase stood at the top of the same curved staircase where everything had once shattered, intact now, catching the light in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like quiet, deliberate healing. In the kitchen below, Nora sat beside Sophia at the same worn table where their friendship had first taken root, guiding her gently through another chapter of literature, humming softly under her breath the same old hymn she had carried with her through every difficult season of her life. They said she was just the maid. They were wrong. She was the truth this family had spent years running from. And in the end, she was the one who finally taught them how to come home to it.